Who wants to get political? It's usually a topic that I prefer to avoid on this channel, but I feel like this is something worth talking about. Specifically, the politics of Runeterra and the somewhat unfortunate implications of Riot storytelling following their original reboot. Now, I want to stress that the title of this video might be a little misleading. I don't think there's actually some grand conspiracy going on at Riot, or even that the controversy we'll be discussing is even that intentional. I think it's more likely the result of some poorly thought out decisions, which I believe we could all stand to learn a thing or two from. For those of you not in the loop or just confused by what I'm even talking about, let's rewind a bit. When League first started out, the world had a very black and white morality system. Demacians were the good guys, Noctians were the bad guys, Piltover was the futuristic utopia city, and Zon was the steampunk hellscape full of mad science and environmental pollution. When the Great Retcon hit, Riot sought to add a bit more moral ambiguity to all of its major factions and players. The first major instance of this was the total overhaul of Shurima's lore, turning it from a civilization of mages undone by one man's hubris to an empire undone by several people's collective hubris. Now, we've discussed Shurima at length on this channel several times, so I won't be getting into the nitty-gritty of everything. All we really need to talk about for this video is, once again, the Xerath and Azir situation. Making a very, very long story short, Xerath was Azir's slave, but also his best friend. Azir promised to free Xerath after taking the throne, but he never did because he was secretly planning to liberate all the slaves, but couldn't be bothered to tell anyone. Xerath thought that Azir went back on his word and plotted to turn himself into a demigod to take his freedom by force. Stuff happens, Xerath's plan works, the capital gets blown up, tons of people die, Xerath gets locked away. Centuries later, Azir comes back as a bird demigod, Xerath gets free, now he's trying to conquer the world out of spite, while Azir is trying to conquer the world, but more politely. Now, when the original version of the story released, without a lot of the supplemental material that added stuff retroactively, a lot of people took issue with it. Specifically, the fact that Xerath was a slave made out to be the bad guy for just wanting to be free. The story very much frames Azir as a tragic hero who perished just before he could right the wrongs of his ancestors, all because Xerath was greedy for power. Azir even got to proclaim the slaves liberated, but Xerath still went through with his plan to murder the Emperor anyway. I've talked at length about how I feel the situation is a lot more nuanced than all that, but I can't deny that, taken at face value, the implications are a bit iffy. Especially with Riot employees tweeting out stuff like, Azir is a dictator, but a kind one. Yeah, if Xerath had just trusted the Emperor, who he had every reason to believe broke his promise and not gone through with stealing the power of Ascension, everything would have worked out fine. I mean, Azir's first act on being revived was to save someone he didn't know. He earned his ascension through an act of compassion, even though we know that's not remotely how the rite is supposed to work. Now, Riot has since walked back on this a bit by showing Azir is capable of being just as cruel as Xerath, embracing the idea that these two are both idiots who misuse the power of Ascension for their own ends. But those first couple years after the Birdman's release definitely veered towards some iffy territory, and this was a trend that Riot would, unfortunately, end up repeating a handful of times. The next big yikes moment came from reworking the Demacia storyline. Demacia has always presented itself as the pristine, shining pinnacle of order and justice, a land of the righteous and noble who fight for honor and virtue above all else. However, post-reboot Demacia has one teensy-weensy, itty-bitty little flaw. They hate magic, in a world that runs almost entirely on magic. Now, the fact that the kingdom was founded by refugees fleeing an arcane apocalypse does make it somewhat understandable why they developed something of a bias towards spellcasters. Unfortunately, this bias results in them capturing or killing anyone who happens to be born with higher than average magical potential, just for having the audacity to be different. The parallels you can draw to real-life prejudices are many, especially when we basically introduce witch hunts and totally not concentration camps into the mix. Needless to say, it's a heavy topic for Riot to try and tackle, and there have been grievances voiced with the ways that they've gone about it. Though Riot has never exactly portrayed mage seekers as the good guys, well, There wasn't really anyone in the lore trying to actively oppose them until Riot introduced Silas, a violent anarchist whose solution to Demasia's corruption is to effectively burn it all down and dispose of authority as a concept. Now, Silas did get a fair bit of character development thanks to the Mage Seeker video game, in which he realized that reforming Demacia instead of outright destroying it was a valid option, but the game still kind of tries to leave him in a little bit of a moral gray area for wanting to overthrow the monarchy, which can come across as a little iffy, especially since Jarvan IV isn't exactly portrayed as the most compassionate or mentally sound leader. Also, given the state of Riot's canon, it's not really clear whether or not the Mage Seeker will really be a factor going forward, so take that how you will. Then there's the Zontover situation, which honestly is way more complicated to talk about now thanks to Arcane and, once again, Riot's insistence that the show is now their main source of canon. For now, though, we're just going to focus on the lore written prior to the show. Longtime veterans will know that Piltover and Zon were originally portrayed as two completely separate cities, but the Great Recon decided to make them two halves of the same city. These factions became a very apt metaphor for classism, with Piltover being the literal upper class that rules over the lower classes of Zon, or the Undercity. Zonites have to live with toxic fumes and refuse leaking down onto them from the Piltovans, and the further down you go, the worse it gets. The situation isn't made any better by the fact that many Piltovans fear Zonites as these uncouth, dangerous, and violent outcasts not to be meddled with. And the thing is, they're not even completely wrong. The problem here is that Zon kinda suffers from the issue that most of its champions are morally dubious at best. You've got Urgot, whose solution to the power imbalance is identical to that of Silas and Demacia. Burn Piltover to the ground no matter who gets hurt in the crossfire. Then you've got Victor, whose character has always been rather complicated, as discussed in a previous video, but he's always been portrayed as at least mildly antagonistic. Oh, and then there's Jinx, who causes chaos purely for the fun of it. Obviously, these are all in the relative minority of Zon's overall populace, and we've gotten plenty of other Zonite champions who prove that. But the fact remains that for many years, the only ones actively trying to push back against Piltover's mistreatment of Zon were violent lunatics. And the good guys in Piltover were never really shown to be making much of an active effort to improve the situation either. Until we got Seraphine. Even then, Seraphine's not exactly been the most active character in the lore. Like, she hosts concerts to try and bring the people of both cities together, and it sort of works, but I think it's going to take way more than people being mutual fans of her music to fix the societal issues leading to all that disparity in the first place. The notions of Seraphine being a protest singer and even standing up to the likes of Camille have been raised plenty of times, but unfortunately she's never canonically done any of that. Also, her original bio that had her knowingly using a Brackrune soul as a battery was a thing for a bit before Riot had to retcon that due to backlash, which really goes to show how poorly they thought through the whole situation. Next, there's the Solari and Lunari conflict. Mount Targon is home to several different religions, but the predominant ones revere the goddesses of the sun and moon. Unfortunately, the sun worshippers have decided that moon worshippers are heretics and either imprison or kill any Lunari they come across that can't be converted. It's a pretty clear-cut case of religious discrimination, made even more obvious by the fact that the sun goddess appears to just be kind of a prick who wants to be revered as the only true light. And yet the Lunari are still portrayed as ethically dubious for fighting back. They assassinate Solari political figures to try and reclaim stolen territory, or even just to defend themselves. Yet it's always felt like Riot is trying to say that both sides are extreme in their actions, when the Lunari have explicitly stated multiple times that they want to coexist. Just feels like a bit of confused messaging. But now let's move on to the big one, the conflict between Ionia and Noxus. The Noxian Empire is hell-bent on taking over all of Runeterra, and one of their biggest obstacles in doing so is the island nation of Ionia. Ionians are largely pacifistic by nature, often preaching that one should never kill needlessly. In fact, many believe that it would be better to be killed than to raise one's fist in unnecessary violence, a belief that is tested when Noxus comes to their shores. Several Ionian champions' backstories revolve around them trying to push back against the invaders, breaking their ancient traditions to do so, and suffering some kind of consequence for it. Lee Sin blinds himself by trying to harness a dragon spirit. Yasuo's framed for the murder of his own master for leaving his post to join the war effort. Yi accidentally draws Noxus's attention to his village, which winds up getting it wiped off the map. Valmar and Kai get themselves fused to a Darkin. Even Karma wound up losing her spiritual connection to the land for fighting back in one version of her bio before Riot changed it. Oh, and let's not forget about Zed, who has tainted himself with literal dark magic in an effort to strike back against Noxian forces. I understand the idea to an extent. That war has forever changed the lives of these Ionians and stripped them of their once peaceful existence. However, the way it's portrayed here, where so many champions suffer negative consequences in the act of just trying to protect their homes and loved ones, it really does seem like Riot's trying to imply that they should have just let themselves be conquered or killed. That they should have let Noxus take over if it meant they could avoid staying their own hands and spirits. Not that this would accomplish much in the long run, because Noxus gleefully killed all the pacifists who didn't fight back anyways, and would probably start molding Ionians into warriors for their conquests in the long run. So yeah, with all of these examples, you can maybe start to see where the problem lies. Again, I don't think anyone at Riot is necessarily trying to say anything, but the way so many of their stories revolve around the idea of facing oppression and how those who fight against it are either insane villains or suffer drastic consequences for doing so, yeah, it creates some disturbing implications. Like, it's fine to have the crazy extremists who want to take things too far as antagonists, but when the only alternative presented is just grin and bear it, things will get better with time if we preach love and understanding enough, it comes off as being a little divorced from reality, if nothing else. Again, this is a conversation that's inevitably going to get deeply political, especially if we start drawing real world parallels. While I still agree that there are some lines that should never be crossed, I also firmly believe in standing up for yourself and your rights if they're being threatened. A very relevant topic in this day and age. A pity that Riot's handling of similar topics hasn't exactly been the most tactful over the years. But what do you all think? Do you agree that League's lore has some rather sloppy morals, or am I just reading way too deeply into things? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and until next time, stay bright.